Good morning. I am stuck. I have two books. I don't know which one to read next. They're both really, really good. So I'm going to read a chapter of each one, and then, and then I'd like you to tell me which one you want to hear the rest of now, and then I'll do the other book second. One of them is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. The other one is Jeremy Thatcher, Dragon Hatcher. So here's chapter 1 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is by C.S. Lewis. It's kind of a famous book. Chapter 1, Lucy looks into the wardrobe. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. McReady and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into this story much. He himself was a very old man with a shaggy white hair, which grew over most of his face as well as on his head, and they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening, when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him. And Edmund, who was the second youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they'd said goodnight to the professor and gone upstairs on the first night, the boys came into the girls' room and they all talked it over. "We've fallen on our feet, and no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like." "I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who was tired and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that." "Like what?" said Susan. "And anyway, it's time you were in bed." "Trying to talk like mother," said Edmund. "And who are you to say when I'm going to bed? Go to bed yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I tell you, this is the sort of house where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes' walk from here down to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between." "What's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she'd ever been in before, and thought of all those long passages and rows of doors leading into empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little creepy. "It's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "It's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds. I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along? And the woods? There might be eagles. There might be stags. There'll be hawks." "Badgers," said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. But when the next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out of the window, you could see neither the mountains nor the woods, nor even a stream to the garden. "Of course it would be raining," said Edmund. They'd just finished their breakfast with the professor and were upstairs in the room he had set apart for them, a long, low room with 2 windows looking out in one direction and 2 in the other. "Do stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. 10 to 1, it'll clear up in an hour or so. And in the meantime, we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books." Wireless is a radio. "Not for me," said Peter. "I'm going to explore the house." Everyone agreed to this, and that was how the adventures began. It was the sort of house that you never seemed to come to the end of, and it was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried led only into spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected that they would. But soon they came to a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armor. And after that was a room all hung with green, with a harp in one corner. And then they came 3 steps down and 5 steps up, and then kind of a little upstairs hall, and a door that led out onto a balcony. And then a whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books. most of them very old books, and some bigger than a Bible in church. Shortly after that, they looked into a room that was quite empty except for one big wardrobe, the sort that has a looking glass in the door. A wardrobe's like a great big dresser, except when you open it up, there's places to hang clothes first too, and a looking glass is a mirror. There was nothing else in the room at all, except a dead blue bottle on the windowsill. I don't know if that's a bug or something. Blue bottle? Maybe. Nothing there, said Peter, and they all trooped out again, all except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door on the wardrobe, even though she felt almost sure it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long coats, long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. Here's that wardrobe right there. You can see it's kind of like a dresser, but it's like a closet, but it's not built into the wall. It's a piece of furniture. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in amongst the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it's very foolish to shut yourself in a wardrobe. Soon she went further in and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as not to bump her face into the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further, then 2 or 3 steps, always expecting to feel woodwork against the tips of her fingers, but she could not feel it. This must be simply an enormous wardrobe, thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of the coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed there was something crunching under her feet. I wonder, is that more mothballs? She thought, stooping down to feel it with her hand. But instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. This is very weird, she said, and went a step or 2 further. The next moment she found that what was rubbing against her face and hands was no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. Why, it's just like branches of trees, exclaimed Lucy. And then she saw that there was light ahead of her, not a few inches away where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later, she found she was standing in the middle of a wood at nighttime with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe, and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew that it's a very silly thing to shut yourself into a wardrobe. It seemed to still be daylight there. I can always get back if anything goes wrong, thought Lucy. She began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow and through the wood toward the other light. In about 10 minutes, she reached it and found it was a lamppost. As she stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood, and wondering what to do next, she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming toward her. And soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow. From the waist upward, he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on them was glossy black, and instead of feet, he had goat's hooves. He also had a tail, but Lucy did not notice this at first because it was neatly caught up over the arm that held the umbrella, so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was rather reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face, with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. One of his hands, as I have said, held the umbrella. In the other arm he carried several brown paper parcels. What with the parcels and the snow, it looked like he'd been doing his Christmas shopping. He was a fawn, and when he saw Lucy, he gave a start of surprise. He dropped all his parcels. goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the fawn. Here's the light, but I don't see the fawn in that picture. That's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2, if we continue with this book at this time, is called What Lucy Found There. So that's chapter 1 of Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. Here's chapter 1 of Jeremy Thatcher, Dragon Hatcher. This is by Bruce Coville, and it's a very different book than that one. Chapter 1 is Love Letter of Doom. Jeremy Thatcher crumpled his paper in disgust. The dragon he'd been trying to draw looked like a dog with wings. "Be right back," he whispered to his friend Specimen. But as he started toward the paper cupboard, a sharp voice asked, "Something wrong, Mr. Thatcher?" Jeremy froze. One of the problems with having Mr. Kravitz for art was that you never knew when it was safe to get a fresh sheet of paper. Clearly, this wasn't one of those days. The tall, pudgy teacher lumbered over to stand in front of Jeremy. "Didn't you hear the school board has frozen spending?" he asked. "That means no new paper orders for the rest of the year. So tell me, is another sheet of paper needed because that drawing was so bad, or because your talent is so important?" Mr. Kravitz gave Jeremy a smug, nasty smile and waited for him to answer. Jeremy hesitated. He wanted to say his talent was that important, but he knew that answer would bring more scorn. He decided to say nothing. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, he turned and shambled back to his seat. As Jeremy slid into his chair, Specimen pointed to a square of lavender paper tucked under the corner of Jeremy's books. "From Mary Lou Hutton," he whispered. "Special delivery." Jeremy resisted the urge to reach out and grab the note. No sense in giving Mr. Kravitz something else to complain about, he thought. But what am I supposed to do now? My paper's gone. Mr. Kravitz won't let me get more, and I've got 15 minutes to go before art is over. His eyes drifted back to the note. He found himself reaching toward the paper. Quickly, he drew his hand back. "Where's Mr. Kravitz?" Looking around, Jeremy spotted the art teacher bending over Jim Magan's desk. Probably telling him in detail what's wrong with his picture, thought Jeremy. Pretending to look at something else, he tugged the lavender square from its hiding place, unfolded it, and began to read. Before Jeremy could finish, Mr. Kravitz came up and snatched the note from his fingers. "Well, Mr. Thatcher," he said gleefully, "I see you've forgotten my feeling about notes in the classroom." Jeremy's cheeks began to burn. "Give it back," he said. "I'm afraid I can't do that," replied Mr. Kravitz with mock sincerity. "It's against my rules. However, since you didn't have a chance to read it to yourself, I will read it aloud for you before I destroy it." "Don't," Jeremy cried in terror. But Mr. Kravitz had begun. "Dear Jeremy," he read in mincing tones, "I think you are incredibly cute, even if you are the shortest boy in the 6th grade. I'm going to kiss you after school today if it's the last thing I ever do." Mr. Kravitz paused, then said, "Oh, yes, there's a P.S. According to this, you have beautiful eyes." The classroom rocked with laughter. Jeremy closed his beautiful eyes. His face got so hot that even the tips of his ears were burning. Mr. Kravitz folded the note and tucked it into his pocket. "No need to embarrass the person who wrote this by reading her signature," he said. "Let's just remember that notes are not appreciated in this classroom." The injustice made Jeremy's head spin. For trying to read a note someone else had given him, he was made to suffer complete humiliation. Yet the person who sent the note was getting off with only a warning. What was going on here? It didn't take him long to figure out the answer. Mary Lou's father was on the school board, so Mr. Kravitz wasn't going to embarrass her. Jeremy quivered with the unfairness of it. "It stinks," he said to Specimen that afternoon. "Stinks, stinks, stinks." "I agree," said Specimen, pushing up his thick glasses with long, crumbly forefinger. "But then everyone knows Kravitz hates you." Jeremy sighed. "All I ever wanted to be is an artist, and the only teacher who's ever really disliked me is my art teacher. I want to know why." Specimen shrugged. "Forget it. Just be glad he isn't judging the art contest." Jeremy nodded. He and Spess had been trying to win the spring art contest for years. First prize was a chance to paint the main window of Zambrano's department store. Jeremy believed he had the best entry for the last 2 years. He hadn't won, though, because top spot traditionally went to a sixth grader, whether or not they actually had the best work. Now he was a sixth grader, so this should be his year. He was the best artist in the school, and everyone, except Mr. Kravitz, knew it. The only person who might possibly beat him was Specimen. They already decided that whichever one of them won, the other would help with the painting. However, that didn't take care of his current problem. The fact that everyone in sixth grade knew Mr. Kravitz was a creep had done nothing to protect Jeremy from the teasing that followed the public reading of Mary Lou's love note. Specimen was the only one who had shown him any sympathy. The other boys, particularly Howard Morton and Freddie the Frog Killer, had razzed him unmercifully. Not that was anything else new. Maybe you should just tell everyone who sent the note, suggested Specimen. Are you out of your mind? Before his friend could answer, Jeremy's stomach lurched with fear. Spess, he hissed. It's Mary Lou. She's headed this way. How did she find us? Asked Specimen. I thought we did a brilliant job sneaking away after school. Jeremy didn't have time to worry about Mary Lou's tracking abilities. Just hold her off, he said desperately. Without waiting for an answer, he sprinted away. Jeremy Thatcher, cried Mary Lou. You get back here. Howard Morton and Freddie the Frog Killer were lingering at the end of the block. Hey, lover boy, called Howard. What's the matter? Don't you want your kissy poo? Jeremy raced past. He regretted the words immediately. Come on, Freddie, yelled Howard. Let's hold the shrimp down so he can get his kiss. Whooping with delight, they joined the chase. Jeremy pumped his short legs even harder. The thought of Mary Lou's puckering lips gave him new speed. Even so, he could hear Howard and Freddie gaining on him. Taking a gamble, Jeremy left the sidewalk and began dodging through backyards. He could still hear the voices of his pursuers. Oh, this chapter's long. Putting an extra burst of speed, he shot past someone's laundry, down a long driveway, out onto a street, and then around a corner. The shrieks and shouts began to fade, but Jeremy ran on until his aching lungs finally forced him to slow to a jog, then a walk. Bending over to hold his throbbing sides, he listened carefully. Silence. He stood to look around. A little pricker ran down his spine. I've never seen this street before. That wouldn't have been so strange in a city, but Bloggett's Crossing was a small town. I've lived here all my life. How can I be lost? Feeling somewhat nervous, Jeremy followed the street till it came to a T. He turned right and entered what began to seem like a maze of unfamiliar streets. Suddenly he noticed a trace of fog moving around his feet. The afternoon seemed darker than it had just a few moments before. As he turned in a slow circle, trying to find the way home, he spotted an old-fashioned shop at the end of the street. Its large front window curved out to make a display space. Thin strips of wood divided the window into many small panes of glass. Printed on the window were the words, Elives' Magic Supplies, S.H. Elives, proprietor. Forgetting his momentary panic, Jeremy walked toward the shop. Who could resist? Maybe I can find something to make Freddie, Howard, and Mary Lou disappear, he thought, feeling deliciously cranky. He didn't really expect that, of course, but he was still excited as he approached the shop. A large brass knocker hung on the center of the door. Jeremy hesitated. Should he knock? You don't knock to go into a store, he told himself. He pressed on the door. It swung open. A small bell tinkled overhead. Once inside, Jeremy began to smile. The shop was dark and mysterious. It smelled of some sort of incense, spicy and sharp, yet strangely pleasant. Magician's equipment crowded the shelves, the display cases, even the floor. A section of one wall was given over to cages filled with rabbits and doves, as well as an odd selection of toads, lizards, and... Jeremy squinted to be sure. Yes, bats. He walked over to the cages and smiled in approval. The mild, musky smell told him the animals were well cared for. After a moment, he turned from the animals and wandered toward the back of the shop. To his left was a shelf lined with top hats. Chains of jewel colored silk scarves stretched across the walls and dangled from the ceiling. Directly ahead of him, resting on a pair of dark red sawhorses, was an enormous box made for sawing people in half. Jeremy spotted an old man, Mr. Elives, polishing a glass countertop. The man's long white hair hung around his shoulders. His walnut-colored skin had more wrinkles than Jeremy's laundry pile. Behind the man, a stuffed owl sat on top of the cash register. At least Jeremy thought the owl was stuffed, until it turned its head, looked directly at him, and began to hoot. Here's the picture of Jeremy in this magic shop, and Mr. Elives is back there. Mr. Elives put down his cloth. "Peace, Uilla," he said. "I know he's here." He turned to Jeremy and frowned, as if the idea of a customer was truly annoying. "Well, what do you want?" he asked sharply. Jeremy blinked. I don't think I want anything," he said. "I just came in to look around." "No one comes into the shop just to look around," said the old man. "But you can start that way. Let me know when you found what you need." Before Jeremy could say that he didn't need anything, the old man picked up his rag and returned his attention to the countertop. "What about fruitcake?" muttered Jeremy, turning his attention back to the display cases. In the first, he found a skull that looked almost real. "The Skull of Truth," read a hand-lettered label underneath it. Next to the skull was a collection of Chinese rings, and next to the rings, resting on a kind of pedestal, was a shining, multicolored ball, almost the size of his fist. 1,000 different hues seemed to shimmer across the glistening surface. Jeremy turned his head slightly, and the colors shifted into a new pattern. He blinked and looked more closely. The colors were moving on their own. "How much does this cost?" he asked. Mr. Elives glanced up from his work. "You don't want that." "How do you know whether I want it or not?" "That's my business." Jeremy wasn't sure if the old man meant knowing that sort of thing was his business, or if he was just saying not to be nosy. Whatever he meant, he was wrong. Jeremy did want the beautiful, ever-changing sphere. "How much is it?" he asked again. Mr. Elives sighed and shuffled over to the display case. "Do you have any idea what this is?" Jeremy shrugged. "Some kind of marble?" "Don't be a fool. Look at it again." Jeremy stared at the strange sphere. "All right, it's too big for a marble. What is it?" "Never mind." Jeremy swallowed. This old guy was even crazier than he looked. If he hadn't wanted to know more about the ball, he might have fled the shop right then. Turning his attention back to the display case, he said, "Can I see it?" "You're seeing it right now." Jeremy barely stopped himself from being truly rude. "I mean," he said carefully, "may I look at it more closely?" The old man hesitated. After a moment, he knelt and opened the wooden drawer at the bottom of the cabinet. It was filled with boxes of all sizes and colors. The old man chose one lined with soft cotton. Next, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an enormous set of keys. He searched through them, muttering to himself, till he found the one he wanted. It was long and black. Unlocking the glass door on the front of the case, he slid it to the right, reached in, and picked up the ball. Placing it gently in the box, he stood and put the box on the counter. Jeremy swallowed nervously. Something strange seemed to be happening inside him. "It's beautiful," he whispered, reaching out and picked it up. The old man moved as if to stop him, then dropped his hand and shrugged. Jeremy lifted the sphere out of the cotton and smiled. It felt warm and comfortable in his hand. He wanted it more than ever. The old man blinked. A puzzled expression wrinkled across his face. Muttering to himself, he reached out, took the ball from Jeremy, and stared at it. For a moment, he seemed worried. Then he sighed and shook his head. "Do you have a quarter?" he asked. "What?" "I said, do you have a quarter? You may have it for a quarter." Jeremy looked up in surprise. "I thought you said I didn't want it." The old man looked directly into Jeremy's eyes. "You don't," he said softly. "It wants you." That's the end of chapter 1 from Jeremy Thatcher Dragon Hatcher. Chapter 2 is Strange Instructions. So let me know which book you'd like me to read next, and I will happily read it.